There he is. I've just told you all about him. Steve Coll, you've done it again. Congratulations. I'm so excited to talk to you about your new book. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it, Pete.
Yes, sir. I have to say to you to your face now, we talked for just a moment before I hit record, just how much your work has meant to me individually, professionally, because I've been talking to all the stakeholders in these wars, veterans, people most affected by them in their countries. And I feel like I know at least beginning to understand what questions to ask and how to be responsible, having read your work over the years. And it's just so vitally important for everybody. And I wonder who talks, who you think reads your stuff. It's journalists, it's Americans who are fascinated, but I feel like not enough policymakers. Who reads Steve Coll?
I guess my sense is people who are interested in America's place in the world or who have had to participate in our expeditionary wars over the last 20 years and who are trying to read for insights into where this started or how it went sideways. And I do have some readership in the policy making and kind of intelligence and analytical diplomatic world. I only know that because they show up at book readings and I'm always surprised. And so I'm grateful for the readership I have, but I think of it sometimes in my own imagination. This may be a silly thing to say, but when I try to think about who I'm writing for, I think of a major in the United States Army who did like 3 tours, two in Iraq, one in Afghanistan, who's now in the reserves and is a curious person and still searching for answers as to what that part of her life or his life was really all about.
Well, your books will offer so many of those answers. A question about how you do it. You're a journalism professor. You have a lot of help on these books with students and others, journalists. But I mean, you are able to recreate conversations that happen between, say, Saddam Hussein and his top people and America's leaders and their top people. How do you do a little bit about how you're able to put a book like this together, and how important were the new documents that apparently you got your hands on that came from the Iraqi point of view?
Yeah, I mean, dialogue, recreating conversations or recasting conversations from records and transcripts, I think is really helpful to readers. Humanizes the story, it keeps the story moving. And so I'm always searching for contemporaneous records, either recordings, that's the gold standard, or handwritten notes that were taken in a meeting verbatim. And in the case of this book, there was a treasure trove of recordings that Saddam Hussein made of his leadership conversations. He recorded them, sort of more assiduously than Richard Nixon, thousands of hours. I learned about the existence of these tapes, but I also learned that they had been withdrawn from public access. So I ended up having to file a Freedom of Information Act request suit. Fortunate to collaborate with a nonprofit called the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And ultimately, I got a big batch of the materials. It's a rare case study. Saddam, in his, on his own terms, he reveals himself and he enlarges our understanding of the origins of the invasion of Iraq. This huge traumatic event in recent American history affected so many hundreds of thousands of Americans. But so it enlarges our understanding of where that came from. It's also very rare as just a case study of the way a dictator thinks and talks at decisive moments of conflict and how he sees the world. So for all of those reasons, it was amazing to work with these materials when I finally got a hold of them.
I want to get into the book, but I do think that probably the most important part of your journalism and your work here is it corrects the record, the official record, as reported by journalists, other media outlets, other policy holders, and maybe even people were in the room. It corrects the record, I feel like, several times, Steve. Do you think that's a fair framing of what your journalism and everything that you got a hold of and were able to report out does in this new book?
I hope so in places. I mean, there are critical sort of junctures in our long relationship with Saddam, mostly a relationship of conflict resulting in this war, but also sometimes we're trying to, get on side with him and collaborate with him. There are these critical moments where um, things go wrong. For example, before he invades Kuwait, when we try to interact with him and we're sort of trying to signal to him that he shouldn't do this, and we fail to prevent him from invading. Well, in America, at least if you're a journalist or a historian, somebody who's interested in what happened, there's like a record out there of how that went wrong, exactly how that went wrong. And there's people who are blamed, whose own reputations have been dragged through the public as responsible for this disaster. And when I go back to an episode like that, I mean, my goal is not to, I don't come with a pre-cooked idea of how to spin it. I just think, well, now we can look at the facts more coldly. Now we have many more facts available to review. We can put them together and try to see whether there's a different version of this that people need to absorb because it's the version that's more likely to stand the test of time. So yeah, I do that self-consciously where it's available and where it's clear that there's a correction that needs to be made.
Specifically, when you're talking about the run up to Saddam's invasion into Iraq, I think one of the records that you do end up correcting is about a young diplomat who gets summoned by Saddam Hussein. This is just a few weeks, I guess, before the invasion and
Kuwait, yeah,
of Kuwait in 1990.
90, yeah.
Her name was April Glaspie. I've never
Hmm.
heard of her. She was the ambassador to Iraq for George H.W. Bush. I feel like you correct the record on what happened there, and I think it's very important. Would you mind telling me a little bit about her and why that matters so much?
Yeah, so she was one of the first sort of pioneering female ambassadors in the U.S. Foreign Service and a fluent Arabic speaker who had served elsewhere in the Arab world, gets sent to Baghdad and is assigned to carry talking points into Saddam. She's not told just go in there and improvise. She's given very specific points that she's supposed to make. She goes into this meeting with him on the eve of what is, it turns out to be his secret plan to invade Kuwait. He, monopolizes the conversation, talks for 45 consecutive minutes. You can barely get a word in edgewise. When she does, she pretty faithfully delivers the talking points that she was given before she went in. So you would say, routine diplomatic meeting. She did her job. She was a messenger of White House policy. Well, after the invasion, people went back to that meeting, I think, trying to defend the Bush administration. And they basically said it was all her fault. She gave him a green light, or she wasn't tough enough with him. And there was this implied, like, why did we send a woman in there? She doesn't know how to talk tough to a guy like Saddam. And it was an easy way to deflect blame from the president and a kind of narrative of Washington. It became like conventional wisdom for years and years. There was a lot of newspaper stories about it. I remember them quite vividly. And so I was sort of stunned when I came back to the subject, interviewed people, looked at the records, the transcripts available. And it was basically all wrong. I mean, yes, the White House failed to send a deterrent message to Saddam, um, but it wasn't her. It was the White House that failed to do that. And anyway, Saddam was lying to them so effectively that it would have taken real genius to see through his BS. And the president was taking advice from Arab leaders who knew Saddam, and they were all telling him that he was, not going to do anything. And so, yeah, the mistake was made for reasons that had nothing to do with April Glaspie. So I tried to rescue her reputation a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's super, super important. And I was fascinated by that. You write, Glaspie had been serving in Iraq for 2 years and in the Arab world for nearly 2 decades. She was respected at state for her knowledge of the Middle East and her professionalism. When she realized she would see Saddam, she had no way to call back to Washington to consult. She did have with her Secretary of State Baker's written instructions about U.S. policy cabled out just a week earlier. However, a second cable from Baker that day before had reiterated those points and added slightly tougher language. Quote, Iraqi statement suggests an intention to resolve outstanding disagreements by the use of force, an approach which is contrary to UN Charter principles. The implications of having oil production and pricing policy in the Gulf determined and enforced by Iraqi guns are disturbing. I mean, just a little bit from one page. If you don't buy the book or the audio book and listen to it, it's all like this. At one point in that section, you're able to report out different interpretations from Tariq Aziz, who was speaking for Saddam, and the American interpretation. They both had note takers there, and somehow Steve Coll gets at the bottom of the difference in those interpretations, and of course why it mattered to what you just said about the narrative that was created around this woman and how she was scapegoated. So great job on that. I don't know if you want to add anything, or I'll move on to my next.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. I mean, my feeling is if you're going to go back to these moments in history, you might as well try to scrub them as best you can. Why just repeat what you've received? And sometimes, there's not something new to say, but here there was.
Let's just talk one more while we're in 1990 and the invasion of Kuwait. About that, it seemed like no one expected it. It seemed like George H.W. Bush was getting the advice, as you just said, of people like the King of Jordan saying they're not going to invade, but they had satellite imagery of more and more men on the border, and at some point it became too late for them to for the Bush administration to issue an official warning. I feel like that is a huge mistake, and one could argue, as your book starts, well, in part one at least of your book, that's where the 20-year conflict kind of begins with the U.S. Yeah. That mistake. What do you want to say about it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's crazy when you look back in hindsight, especially after our recent collective experience of watching the Russian buildup before they invade Ukraine. And then we could see what they had, all their tanks in position. We could see the satellites, like there was nothing hidden. And we, the Biden administration, and European governments, like they issued all these warnings. He's going to invade, he's going to invade. And then he did. Well, in this case, the one that ended up turning the Middle East upside down and ultimately led to the Iraq War in 2003, the same thing was true. We could see him building up, building up, building up. There were tanks on the road, but there was this conventional wisdom, groupthink uh, across the Middle East and in Washington that it was all a bluff, that it was all about getting a financial concession from Kuwait, and maybe also from the Saudis and UAE, because it had to do with loans that they had provided to Saddam during his war with Iran, and Saddam wanted those loans forgiven. He wanted them wiped off the books, and the Kuwaitis just wouldn't budge. So in what we know now is that in response to the Kuwaiti stubbornness, he decided to loot their country, take it over and occupy it, turn it into a new province of Iraq. But at the time, when he was building up to do that, somehow the whole world convinced itself, including a very smart president with a lot of foreign policy experience and experience in the Arab world, George H.W. Bush,
former head of the CIA,
former head of the CIA, ambassador to the UN, oil man. So, like, as qualified as you're going to get. Yeah. And they all convinced him that it was all just a bluff. And there was an oral history with one of the senior diplomats in the Bush administration, and he said, look, it was crazy because he wasn't hiding Saddam. He had all these tanks out there, and we could send our diplomats and our defense attaches up and down the highway to the Kuwait, and we could count the tanks and count the armored personnel carriers. And yet, I still thought that it was all a bluff and that it was just going to end with money changing hands. Like at some point, the Kuwaitis were just going to call up and say, okay, here's $30 billion, turn around. The Kuwaitis never budged. They continued to think that he wouldn't do it, and that the best thing was, it's like a kid having a tantrum. Just ignore him. Let him burn it out. That's what they advised Bush. Like, they wouldn't even meet with Bush. Don't show any military force. Don't threaten him. Just pretend he's not there. And that ended up also being a very bad call from the perspective of Kuwait.
And so he invades Kuwait, and Bush finds out, and I forget the exact quote, but it's like they hear that there's shooting being reported in Kuwait, and Bush is like, too late for the warning. Is that right?
Yeah, it's a great scene where Bush, this is what presidents do to relax. Apparently he was out like hitting golf balls on some like White House golf ball range. I don't know what it was, but he was hitting golf balls and his shoulder flared up. So he goes down into the White House medical bay to get a heat treatment. And his national security advisor and the head of the National Security Council's Middle East section run down because now they've got word that, oh, this is for real. Better call Saddam and tell him to stop. Finally, we better tell him, don't even think about it. And as they're suggesting this to the president who's sitting on this medical table getting the heat treatment, somebody comes in and says, there's gunshots in downtown Kuwait City. And Bush says, I guess it's too late for a phone call.
Little late to call Saddam now. Shoulders aching up. I guess I have to make that call later. Oh my God. I mean, like, it is so hard to interview you for any of your books because every page deserves a question for you to answer. So I guess people are just going to have to go buy that. But I do have to skip ahead just a moment, if you will, in time in the book, not in real time. People might remember that there was an ultimatum after the invasion. They forced out the Kuwaiti family, killed one of the crown princes. This is all I'm learning from reading your new book. And all kinds of crazy things are happening then in Kuwait. They're trying to erase Kuwait in a way, the occupied Iraqi forces. And the initial invasion, 40 helicopters or something went down. Iraqi helicopters went down. They banged into each other. They hit telephone lines. When I read that in your book, I was just, I don't know if there's ever been a military force like that, 40 helicopters in modern time or ever going down like that. I feel like it illustrated how unqualified or unprepared they were to invade his military. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm underestimating them.
No, I mean, they had a professional military that was in some ways quite capable, but the civilians that oversaw it were just, amateurs. And it's not really clear how the very bad orders to fly super low in these helicopters, which led them to crash into power lines and crash into each other, were given. But it seems like it might have been Saddam's son-in-law who came up with that idea. But they had never practiced this. That's one of the problems with a surprise invasion. You can't necessarily practice all the things you're going to have to do in the dark. They didn't have night vision equipment. And so, yeah, it was a disastrous start. And was one of the reasons why the Kuwaiti royal family survived. I think if those special forces units had been able to fly to their targets and drop their commandos, they might have, ended this branch of the Kuwaiti royal family's existence. But
Yeah,
they
they all
took
got
just enough time to get away.
you guess the royal family all got in a couple cars and they took off. And then one prince came back. He's like, "You guys left without me," and then they killed him.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it was a sad thing because he just kind of got the phone call late, and the emir and a lot of the other senior members of the royal family had gotten into their Mercedes sedans and raced away to Saudi Arabia.
That's crazy how you are able to illustrate all of this in the book. It's so interesting. Take me to, I think it's Geneva. Is it Secretary of State Baker and Tariq Aziz? This is post-invasion, and people will remember there was a deadline, January 15th, 91. I remember being in the airport. We were going on vacation. I was in high school. And I remember seeing it all play out on CNN, the tracers, the anti-aircraft fires, everything. When it happened, the entire country, the U.S., was wrapped in a way we'd never been because it was live. Bernard Shaw's on the hotel room floor.
Oh, yeah,
for CNN.
Bernard Shaw. Yeah.
But I mean, so is that right? It's in Geneva. It's a few days before, and Baker knows that they've used chemical weapons, mustard gas in the war against Iran, and lobbies a threat to Tariq Aziz.
Yeah, I think it's one of the important kind of lessons that goes beyond the history of Saddam and his conflict with the United States, because you set it up well. The war is about to begin. The U.S. has led the assemblage of a massive ground force outside of Kuwait, hundreds of thousands of troops, and they've told Saddam there's a deadline. If you don't withdraw from Kuwait, we're going to expel you. And they also know that Saddam has used chemical weapons against Iranian troops during the long war in the 1980s, and that he's gassed Kurdish Iraqis who rebelled against his regime. So there's no doubt that he has the gas and that he knows how to use it and that it's a terrible weapon. And so Baker goes into this meeting with Tariq Aziz, who is Saddam's top envoy to the rest of the world, for the specific purpose of sending him a message, which, in informal terms sounds like this. All right, we're going to go to war unless you withdraw. It's going to be a fair fight. You're going to lose it. You're going to regret it. We're going to beat the crap out of you, but it's just war, like we always have. However, if you gas our troops with chemical weapons, it's going to be a whole different thing. We're going to obliterate your regime. We're going to end your regime, and your civilization is going to be set back for many decades. Now, Baker didn't mention nuclear weapons, but Saddam already had it in his head that the Americans would nuke him if they felt sufficiently aggravated.
Or the Israelis, you say?
Or the Israelis. So what happened was, before that warning, Saddam had deployed chemical weapons to the front lines, and he had basically organized his chemical forces the way he did when he used gas against Iranians in particular. But after that warning, he, at the last minute, at the moment of decision, he said, stand down, don't gas these guys. And
The Americans.
the Americans. And so the lesson is deterrence works sometimes with even the most irrational seeming dictators, even ones who talk with, bombast in public, even ones who have done terrible things, and you might reasonably think they'll do it again. It is worth taking the effort to carefully deliver a deterrence message, as Baker did for Bush, because I think the best way to interpret the facts is that it was received and it made a difference.
Although, as we learn in your book, he's so rational and irrational. So such a paradox, it would seem, Saddam, at so many times. And you go a long way. I don't know if anybody's ever documented a biography about him, at least as it relates to national security and this time period, much less his early life. I mean, I learned so much. Fascinating. Dude, if he wasn't so evil, what an exciting, crazy life. He gets shot. He goes into exile. He goes into jail. He's in custody. He climbs out a window while he's in custody. I didn't know any of this. And then, of course, we know how his life ended, and you document that really well as well. But I think it's really important that we don't learn about the Iraqi people or any other country's people because through their worst people. You do a great job to introduce us to a whole bunch of other Iraqis, dissidents, heroes, politicians, and others, including very complicated story of two scientists that helps illustrate Saddam Hussein's quest to get an atomic weapon. And tell us a little bit about those scientists. And did you release the Achilles Trap to correspond with the release of Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
There are some overlaps. And I did think about asking you this stupid question, but you can explain it. But it's like in Oppenheimer, we learn, if you didn't already know, that the U.S. government asked all of the best scientists here and abroad, no matter who they were, to come help. In Iraq, he didn't ask his best scientists, did he?
Yeah, he sent a message that they couldn't refuse. So, yeah, the book opens with Jafar Dia Jafar, who is the Robert Oppenheimer of Iraq, a British-trained physicist, quite a talented character in his field, and somebody who I interviewed and corresponded with at some length to put the book together. And so Jafar was arrested, imprisoned, detained, put under house arrest because he fell under political suspicion. And at the same time, after some period in detention, Saddam summoned him and said, "Look, we need you to build a bomb," and he agreed to do it. But this scientist's best friend was another physicist trained in Canada, Hussein al-Shahristani, who was also asked to build a bomb, tortured when he refused. And he basically thought to himself, as he recounted later, if Saddam gets a nuclear bomb, he's most likely to use it on Iraqis rather than anybody else. I'm just not going to cooperate with this. He ended up, suffering in indescribable ways, solitary confinement in Abu Ghraib for many years. Later escaped, went into exile, and later, after the invasion, became a figure in post-Saddam Iraq. But the stories of those scientists to me are both interesting because they tell us why we thought Saddam had a nuclear weapons program and what really lay behind it, the kind of Oppenheimer story of what really lay behind it, which is just not understood at all. But also because they kind of complicate our understanding, I think in a useful way, of what these dictatorships really are. They're made up of people who have PhDs and families and are making really hard choices about whether to be complicit with a regime that they find distasteful or don't like. They see themselves as Iraqi patriots, but then how far should they go to serve a government that they know is wrong and that they themselves are afraid of? How much suffering personally and torture are they willing to endure for dissent? I mean, all of these are the stories of ordinary Iraqis during Saddam's reign, and it's hard to do justice to it in full, but I tried to pick out some people who could carry some of that moral kind of weight that goes along with a regime like this.
Yeah, you did a really good job at that, and the other guy's name, you just mentioned, the other scientist, he died in 2003, right, in DC. Is that right? After giving a talk, is that right?
No,
No.
Hussein al-Shahrastani is still alive. At least he was a couple of months ago when I was speaking to him.
Oh, who am I thinking of? Who was working? He was talking to Daniel Pipes, and he's in D.C.
Oh, he was
He was killed.
Nizar Hamdoun,
Ah,
who was Saddam's, along with Tariq Aziz, Saddam's kind of most important diplomat in dealing with the Americans. He was the ambassador in Washington for a while during an era of cooperation between the U.S. and Iraq. And then later he was at the UN. And he died of cancer on July 4th, 2003 in New York City after the invasion. And it's a poignant story about his warnings about the future that turned out to be
well, I'm not
grim.
embarrassed I got that wrong, because you were able to explain who that guy is, and it has a helpful explainer at the beginning of the book. And each one of these, if I said their name, you could tell us an interesting story about them. But I guess I have to move, and I hate to section part 2 of the book, and it's divided by time period, really. And the first period, of course, is the enemy of my enemy, December 79 to 1990. So we're talking Reagan administration and that State Department and that CIA. And then it goes in part 2, Liar's Truth, August 1990 to September 2001. And I guess I just want to ask you about the Clinton administration and his relationship to Iraq, and why it played a pivotal role in not necessarily discouraging Saddam Hussein, who thought apparently that his policies were weak. And maybe they were, because they certainly were influenced by domestic politics. How did the Monica Lewinsky affair play into U.S.-Iraq national security issues?
Yeah. Well, so Clinton takes office in January of 1993, and the Bush administration's whole experience of foreign policy had been dominated by the war in Kuwait, the victory of an expelling Saddam, ticker tape parade in New York, and then controversy about the aftermath of the war and so forth. And Clinton's attitude, as his aides describe it, was that's Bush's stuff. I don't want anything to do with this. I've got other fish to fry. I ran on it's the economy, stupid. I want to work on domestic affairs. So keep Iraq off my desk. Well, they tried for a few years. They let the UN carry a lot of the effort to contain Saddam, to disarm Saddam, to find his and destroy his WMD. That was all going on during the first part of the Clinton administration. But eventually, as is true for every president, you might want to be done with the Middle East, but the Middle East isn't done with you. And Saddam started, just shaking the trees again, threatening to invade Kuwait again, other things. Eventually, Clinton got drawn back into trying to figure out how to put Saddam in a box. And what's interesting about the Monica Lewinsky period, which is obviously in his second term, 98, 99, by that point, Clinton had tried to ignore Saddam. He tried to contain Saddam. And finally, he decided that he wanted to get rid of Saddam. So you almost feel like against his better judgment, he summons the CIA, says, "You guys think you can do a coup? I'm with you. Give it a try." And then the coup doesn't work. It's kind of embarrassing. It falls apart kind of in public view. And then he still asked Madeleine Albright, his Secretary of State, to go out and give a speech saying, "Our policy is to get rid of Saddam Hussein. He can cooperate with the UN. He can disarm himself. Doesn't matter. We're not changing our sanctions or our pressure on him until he's gone." And it's just interesting to remember that George W. Bush inherited as national policy from Bill Clinton a regime change policy. That was where Clinton ended up
Right.
in frustration by the end of it. So, yeah, but you make the point that Saddam saw Clinton as weak, and it's true. because the Clinton administration was trying to calibrate its response to Saddam's outrageous, sort of rule violations, and they would typically just hit him with cruise missiles or some laser-guided bombs for a day, 2 days, 3 days, and that was it. And so Saddam concluded, that the United States was so averse to the risk of casualties in a ground war that they were only going to use these kind of robot tools to hit some of his buildings, usually when nobody was in them, and that he didn't really have to worry about a ground invasion. So he completely misread the Bush administration right up until a few months before the war. He really thought it wasn't going to happen.
About those sanctions, I recall all the reporting and certainly anti-war activism on the left, critics of the Clinton administration. I remember meeting former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and remembering thinking, if I had one question for her, I would want to ask, about those sanctions, because I remember the American left always talked about how many innocent children died as a result of the sanctions. They weren't getting their food, they weren't getting their medicine, and we can talk about whose fault that was. Was it being sent and it went through Saddam and it didn't get to them? But what is the legacy of the Clinton administration and the sanctions in terms of the humanitarian disaster that a lot of people say that there was?
Well, I mean, the sanctions cost hundreds of thousands of lives. I think that's, there's a debate in academia about exactly how many tens of thousands of lives could be directly attributed to the sanctions, but a lot is the answer. And this was the Clinton administration's policy. It was a way, we sometimes see sanctions as an alternative to war. That is the rationale. It's a way to put non-lethal pressure on a leader. But what we've learned is that they don't often work. They rarely work. They don't change leaders' minds. That the leader and his regime can manipulate the sanctions to enrich themselves, their families, their cronies, but that the public can't do that, and so suffers disproportionately. And it's in the political science literature. I mean, it's empirical evidence now that sanctions don't work. And I think Iraq is regarded as a particularly brutal case of kind of international, mostly Western American and European and UK indifference to the cost that was being borne by ordinary Iraqis. And yeah, Saddam played the whole sanctions regime brilliantly. He figured out how to manipulate what was permitted, and then he ran a big smuggling operation, and he and his family did pretty well.
You mentioned his family, which is threaded throughout the book. How many attempts were there, legitimate attempts, on Saddam Hussein's life, and how concerned was he each and every day that there would be one?
He woke up every morning worried about the attacks on him. I mean, I'm sure he imagined many more conspiracies than there were in fact, but there were certainly, depending on how you want to count the seriousness of the attempts, half a dozen assassination attempts against him by various parties. But it's ironic because the three presidents, the two Bush presidents and Clinton, signed executive orders authorizing the CIA to foment a coup and to use lethal force, or to support Iraqis using lethal force against Saddam if necessary. And yet, so for all this effort, millions of dollars expended on these coup plots, many efforts to come up with a plan to get close to Saddam, to find a tank commander who would roll into the palace and get rid of him. For all of that work, in the end, what the new documents show is that the one time somebody almost killed Saddam, it was his son, Uday, right, who turns up at the palace enraged with an AK-47, shoots it off at the feet of his brother and his uncle, and is screaming about killing his father. He finally bursts into tears. They kind of take the gun away from him gently, and it all ends in sort of family reconciliation. But it's like The Sopranos. I mean,
of course, it is. It's just like that. It's a family. It's royal. All the indiscretions and violence of the royal family. In this case, you mentioned Uday. He was the older one, I guess, and at some point, Qusay thought of his younger brother, thought of killing him because he was such a mess, and they sent him out of the country for a little while. But I mean, there's so much.
They sent him to Switzerland, where he arrived with,
Oh,
50 fur coats. He like beats a guy up in a nightclub, and then he shoots a driver at the Iraqi embassy in Geneva, and they cover it up successfully by claiming the guy was cleaning his gun and shot himself, and then Uday is bundled out of the country before the Swiss police can get after him. I
it's
mean,
crazy.
it's
Reading
wild.
every page is like that, and learning all these new things. I think, speaking of assassinations, one of the most important things, the Achilles Trap, I think, teaches us there's new evidence that raises doubts about the truth of any accusations that Saddam Hussein had ever given any order or made any attempt to try to assassinate President George H.W. Bush, which, by the way, he had a really interesting, complicated relationship with. They used to write letters to each other before they decided, that they didn't
Yeah.
like each other. But, I mean, I think that's a really important point. A lot of people say that George W. Bush, when he was president, partly went to war in Iraq because he tried to kill my dad. And so did Jeb Bush, apparently mentioned that in 2006 that you have in there. What do we learn? What did you learn about the actual potential attempts on George H.W. Bush when he was president by Saddam Hussein?
Yeah, it's another crazy story. It was right after his presidency in 1993, because he had liberated Kuwait. The Emir of Kuwait, restored to his throne, invited HW and an entourage to Kuwait to be honored, and he came with family members. Laura Bush, his brother Jeb, I think, was there, and they they're fed it at a huge banquet. He makes some speeches. 2 or 3 days later, he flies away unharmed. No incident, no gunfire, no assassination attempt, nothing. A week later, the Kuwaitis announced that they've thwarted an assassination attempt against HW because they've discovered a car bomb in a warehouse, which they said was smuggled in by Saddam in order to blow up HW while he was there. Well, the Clinton administration goes crazy. They send the CIA, the FBI out there to investigate it. And the evidence consists of this car bomb, which clearly was made by Saddam's Iraqi intelligence service. But there were a bunch of those found during the occupation of Kuwait that he had sent in as kind of unconventional weapons, not just to Kuwait, but to the UAE and other places. So it seems quite likely that the bomb was pre Bush's visit, like years before Bush's visit. The Kuwaitis probably found it parked in some warehouse, and then they decided we can make a prop to make it seem like he tried to blow up Saddam. But there was more evidence that it was a plot. There were these whiskey smugglers who were arrested, probably treated pretty roughly in Kuwaiti custody. They confessed to being Saddam's assassins. So the whole thing just
And
smelled
fast
like,
in quotes.
yes. And so Clinton's national security advisor, Sandy Berger, was like, "This is a setup. This is a joke." He's a lawyer, like he's a kind of evidence guy. He's like, "I'm not convinced. This is the Kuwaitis trying to shift blame on Saddam. I don't care about Saddam's reputation, but we're not going to counterattack and blow up Baghdad on the basis of this phony story." That's what he was arguing. But others said, "Look, the bomb is real. That's clearly Saddam's. It's in Kuwait. That's enough evidence to convince us." So I was curious, going back over all of this, um, because there's this huge trove of records and tapes that we now have that we didn't have then. Like, is there any mention in any of those records of Saddam taking credit for this? Because it became a big public story, and he's
Yeah,
not shy about saying, "I'm the worst thing that ever happened to the Bushes."
right. Sure.
So,
It's
so
believable.
I, yeah, so the answer is that they searched these files. They tried every kind of search term they could, the tapes, the transcripts. There's no record of him ever talking about it. And it's just puzzling. Now, it's hard to prove the absence of something, so I can't say definitively that it was a phony plot, but I came away leaning toward the view that it was a phony plot.
Well, I will trust your judgment every single time, Steve Coll. Let me ask you about Saddam Hussein and September 11th. What was his reaction that day to who did that, what it meant for him and Iraq?
He really didn't. He appreciated the scale of the attacks. He wasn't, sort of crowing over the loss of life or anything like that. But he basically had the reaction that a lot of people in the Arab world had, which is, that's all America's fault. Now you'll see the price of your misguided foreign policy. And so, nobody wishes for the loss of innocent life, but you had this coming. And then he gets worse and worse as a kind of pundit. Over the ensuing days and weeks, everybody he meets, he's got to tell them about how America is now just getting its just desserts and explaining America's role in the world as if, people didn't understand that he was hostile to the United States. He didn't have any awareness that this event might threaten him. He really didn't get it. He was confused that people might use this as a pretense to attack him. He clearly didn't feel any responsibility for 9/11. He said, when he talks about bin Laden or Al Qaeda, it's like, yeah, these guys are just fundamentalists. I don't have anything to do with them. But, their anger reflects a broader anger towards American foreign policy, or again, a kind of typical view in cafes in the Arab world in the fall of 2001. But he was very slow to recognize that, in fact, you're going to be blamed for this. And it took him really about a year before he really internalized the idea that he was being targeted for this crime that he felt quite adamantly innocent about. And there was this episode where he refused to apologize. He refused to express condolences to the American people or to the American government over the loss of life on 9/11. He said, look, we're at war with these people. They kill our people. We're not responsible for this. It's humiliating for me to have to offer condolences. And then he gets criticized for that over and over again. It's evidence of his complicity in 9/11, as people say. And he feels there's this kind of strange cultural sense of honor. His honor is being impugned because he didn't express condolences, and he becomes obsessive about this, and he ends up delivering a UN speech about it. Finally, some years later, he offers condolences. But that was about as much as he could muster of a kind of accurate understanding of the significance of 9/11 in American life and what it would mean for Iraq.
I feel like one of the most important questions gets answered, I think, pretty aptly in your book is, if Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction, why did he not do more to make that clear, to allow weapons inspectors and other members of the international community to come and see? And it's just crazy to think, as you're reading this book, you stop and like, oh my God, I can't believe Saddam Hussein tangled with George H.W. Bush and then his son in such a similar way. What a strange relationship those families have connected forever in history. But both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush basically gave him ultimatums in 90 to 91. And then, of course, 2002, 2003 to run up to the Iraq War. But why didn't Saddam make it more clear that he did not have weapons of mass destruction, thus preventing what seemed like an inevitable invasion?
Right. So it's the proverbial $64,000 question, and I think in encapsulated there are maybe three or four important reasons, and I'll be brief. Just to set the context, after the invasion of Kuwait, when he was thrown out in the summer of 1991, he secretly destroyed his chemical biological weapons, ordered the dismantling of his nuclear weapons program as best as it could be accomplished, and then he lied about it to the inspectors who showed up to document what he'd done. So he complied with international demands, but then he didn't admit what he had done. Why? Hard to understand. Partly it was that he was afraid that if he admitted that he had destroyed all of these weapons, that he would be vulnerable to attack, either by his enemies, the Iranians, the Israelis, or coup makers inside Iraq would see him as weakened by this disarmament that he had undertaken. A close relative of that reason would be that he sought glory in the Arab world, and he felt that the whole thing was humiliating. And he just wasn't going to stand for being humiliated by a bunch of guys in white lab coats with clipboards documenting the destruction of everything that he had ever built up. And then I think another interesting reason as time goes along is that, like a lot of leaders, in that part of the world and elsewhere, he thinks that the CIA is omniscient, that they know
Right.
everything,
Right.
and that they know that he doesn't have this stuff. They know what he did because they know everything. And nonetheless, they're accusing him of having it. What does that tell you? He says. It tells you that this is a pretense to sell pressure on him, a
Right.
war against him, his own demise. And so why should he play that game? Why should why should he be part of this theater that the CIA has, essentially cooked up against him?
I'm reminded always often when I think about this time of an interview I did with former Senator Lincoln Chafee. He was a Rhode
Mm,
Island senator. I think he was an independent. And I'll never
mm,
forget this interview. He told me, I think it was 2008, he'd written a book and he came in, it was a Sirius XM, and he said, listen, I go, why did you, I think he's the only senator to vote against authorization, one of the only Republican leaning, I guess, one of the only senators to vote against authorization for invading Iraq. And I said, why? Why'd you vote against it? And he said, because as a U.S. senator, you have the privilege of getting a presentation at Langley. So I went to Langley and I met with CIA and asked them to show me the proof. And he said they didn't even really try.
mm.
And I was like, well, I'm not sure what the CIA was telling who, when, what, but George Tenet certainly told Colin Powell that it was a slam dunk, and Colin Powell made him sit right behind him so history could remember that. I know I don't have a lot of time left, but anything you want to say about that time period that you discovered that was new, that was different from the official record that you wrote about in the Achilles Trap of that time, and what the U.S. knew or didn't know about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq?
Yeah, I mean, we really were victimized by our own kind of groupthink, but also the fact that we didn't talk to Saddam for 10 or 12 years, and we didn't have any insights into the fact that after 9/11, he was not actually the same person that he had been in 1990 or in
Neither was
1980.
Dick Cheney, I think.
Yeah, he had grown into his 60s, and you know what he was doing in the run-up to the invasion of 2003? He was writing novels. He was obsessed with his own career as a novel author. He wrote four in several years. He mystified his aides. He would disappear for days at a time, and he would write in handwritten Arabic these long entries into his next novel and then send them over to his editors and say, mark these up for grammar. They'd mark them up with some corrections. He would reject all the corrections. So they thought, okay, let's stop correcting him. And he got his fourth novel out just as the American tanks were rolling towards Baghdad. And
Crazy, crazy.
so, like, we didn't
He was
understand,
writing
like,
novels.
yeah, he had lost some of his fascination, his obsession with military affairs, micromanaging the war machine, and he was as interested in his legacy as an author as anything else. And um, so that was one of those things that if you had told CIA analysts to maybe think again about their assumptions about his aggression or his WMD ambitions, because he's busy, inviting novelists and poets into his office to talk literature because he sees himself now as part of like a book club. I mean, they would have said, I can't go brief that to the president. I'll be laughed
Right,
out of the Oval
right,
Office. But
right.
it turns out that was true. And, you know, we just, we didn't know what we didn't know, I'm afraid. And some of it was quite profound.
So much more that we learn in the book. Safe to say, we never found any weapons of mass destruction
No, yeah,
or a
there
link to
weren't,
Al Qaeda.
no, none of that was there to be found as it happens.
Steve, congratulations. The Achilles Trap is so good. I couldn't put it down. I did not get nearly as much done as I normally would in the last couple of weeks because I'm a slow reader, but I just ate up all of this as I do all of your work. And it's, it means a lot to me that we're still talking and that you're still out there producing such amazing and important work. I really appreciate you.
Well, your enthusiasm is really a gift to me, and I'm grateful for it.